another one.
Right. I forgot. Are we good? Are we live? All right. Welcome everybody to live Q&A. Everybody joining us online.
Yes.
Thank you very much. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. I am the pastor.
I am the recovering heretic.
We are without the bishop this time, but we thank you for joining us last time. And hi, Dan.
Seems fitting, a heretic without a bishop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's the
It
way it's supposed to
happens,
be.
yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Let's just cut right to the chase today.
Oh, we had one. Before we get into our questions, I had a reader submitted question, a listener submitted question.
Okay, yes.
So Karen Harvey asked, can you be spiritually mature without being emotionally mature? My answer to that is yes. I think they're two different qualities.
Yes.
And I also think Jesus seems to identify spiritual maturity as childlike, and so in a certain sense, like Emma and Ada are more spiritually mature than all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a childlike quality to it, right? Yeah. So it's got nothing to do with age per se. It's and so absolutely those are two different things, and they can be treated very differently.
Yeah.
So
and that's absolutely in my bailiwick with leadership development, because you have to parse out a person's personality components.
Right.
And there's a spiritual component to leadership. There's an emotional component.
Yeah.
And then there's obviously the leadership ability.
Right.
And they are three distinct
things,
aspects.
Right.
And they do feed into each other, but you don't need high EQ, emotional quotient, to be high in spiritual, and that is scientifically verified.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think you can be like both, and I think they help each other definitely. But like is there again, I do think if we're being honest about what Jesus says, like Emma and Ada come to the sacraments and come to the table with more spiritual maturity, than anybody else. Some people ask us sometimes, why do we baptize infants? And it's like, well, I firmly believe if an infant can trust its mother, which it does, why can't an infant trust God? And so if an infant can trust its parents, why can't it trust God? And that's the kind of trust we're called to,
I think, and that holds true if you look at historical figures as well. Everyone from Gandhi to Francis of Assisi, it's one of the big components that many of them have that people comment on is how childlike their spirituality is, and sometimes their behavior as a result. They'll be caught giggling, when they're in a deep spiritual state. They are very childlike.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yay! But there's hope for me then.
Yes, absolutely.
There you go, Renee. Always saying how immature I am. It's playing into my favor.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, something then heavier. Our main topic today. And maybe it is childlike in the fact that I get confused with a lot of Jesus's parables. And today's, and thank goodness you had a sermon all about it, but we'll clarify more now in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Supposedly a parable is there to teach you a lesson. That's supposed to be part of it. It's like an Aesop's fable, There's supposed to be some lesson in there.
So right off the bat,
okay.
I would say, I think a parable is different than a fable.
Okay.
And I think we often make this mistake because we often draw fable-like conclusions. But a parable is meant more to raise questions about your basic assumptions. It's not actually a fable. You're right, has a clear
moral message
to it. And I think Jesus's parables are not clear moral messages necessarily. They are more intended to raise basic questions, like challenge your underlying assumptions about usually about God, but challenge your underlying assumptions about how the world works and how God works, and sometimes that means you draw a very clear conclusion. But I think the conclusion is secondary to
Just getting you to
just
think.
getting you out of, like, shaking you loose,
Yeah.
from the rust of how you think it should normally work,
Yeah.
and so that's a little different than a fable, but that's a good thing to bring up because I do think we treat them like fables, but they're more meant to be like, huh,
Yeah.
like, what does that say about God? That's kind of the next, the quote, the thing, Jesus wants you to think about.
So it reminds me of Carlos Castaneda um, with his wisdom shaman, Don
Yeah.
Juan, and the way he would get you to
Hmm.
enter being able to see the next spiritual realm was he would physically sometimes just whack your back, whack the
Right.
back of your head,
Right. It's like just
and
right.
you're to shift your perspective.
Right. And he's knocking your perspective a bit out of whack. So
So
yes.
that's part of what, apparently, a major part of what a parable then is supposed to be. It's that
Right.
metaphorical
Right.
whack you upside the head.
Right. Exactly.
So why then is that why some of Jesus's parables are so obtuse? They're really meant to get you thinking deeply.
Yeah, I mean, they are. Some of them are really just meant to, are really meant to make you. Some of them are obtuse because we're in the wrong spot in light, or situation in life is we're in the wrong spot. So like,
Yeah.
so with this Sunday's parable, common mistake we always make is um always assuming the most powerful person is God in the story. And like, I'm not necessarily sure that's true.
In this one.
Well, in any story, like, you should
Oh,
just be
okay.
careful of that. Like, I'm not sure you should automatically assume any one of them is automatically God, right? And so um last week's parables, some, because I think this week the rich man is God, but I think it's saying something different about God than we usually expect.
Yeah.
But last week's is a good example with the woman who loses the coin, right?
Yeah.
And everybody, oh, God is like this woman who searches for this coin. But if you think about that assumption for just 2 minutes, it's actually, does that mean God loses us?
And
Does
it
that
has to
mean,
hunt us down
right?
again.
Does that mean God misplaces us? Like, that's like, I don't like that image very much,
Yeah.
and so we assume because that woman's the most powerful person in the story that she's, God. And
Yeah.
it's like, well, maybe we should hold off on that assumption
Mhm.
just a moment.
Maybe God is the coin.
Maybe God is the coin, right? Or maybe, we are the woman, and it's a commendation about how we're supposed to seek out the lost,
Mhm.
right? Like, be careful assuming the most powerful person in the story
Yeah.
is God, because that's something we do as powerful Western Christians, you know, citizens of a strong nation. Like, that's something we assume power equals good, and
Mhm.
so we put the powerful person automatically in God's place. And I'm not sure Jesus was always doing that,
Yeah. And this particular parable of it seems so odd from
Hmm.
the standpoint that you're not sure who's the hero, who's the villain, who's got the real power, who doesn't.
Yeah.
Um, and everything is very, very, very murky. But then at the very end, he says, you can't serve God and wealth, which is very clear cut.
Yeah.
And a couple of questions on that. First, let me start with the back end. This interpretation says wealth, but
Mhm.
doesn't it originally say mammon?
Yeah. So
And
it's,
mammon isn't technically just wealth the way we think of it, is it?
uh
It seems more layered.
yeah, it is mammon, right? So it is mammon, which right, and the RS. I toyed with reading the original Revised Standard Version this week,
Okay.
just because the original version has Jesus saying, "Make friends of yourselves by dishonest mammon." you know,
Which seems kind of a contradiction there. I mean,
well, or redundant, right? Like,
yeah,
isn't all mammon redundant?
yeah.
Or dishonest. Yeah, I guess I would say that the two shades of meaning to that are, Mammon's also a demon, and so there's a we think of wealth as this impersonal force, but Jesus is saying mammon, so it's a demonic. Wealth has this demonic personality to it that is part and parcel with it all. Yeah, and also wealth isn't just like mammon's a little different than wealth in that mammon's more like greedy riches, right? Like true greed. And we don't think of wealth that way. Perhaps we should, but we don't. You know.
So why did this version say wealth instead of
Because if I
mammon?
said mammon, nobody out there would know what I was talking about, besides you, who grew up Catholic. Like most people in the pews would be like, "What the heck is mammon?"
Gotcha.
And so then I'd have to explain what mammon is,
And there goes the whole.
and then there'd be 10 minutes more on the sermon, and it's like, just say wealth, it's fine.
Yeah, okay, we'll just go with that.
Yeah.
Well, let's start digging into the parable itself then,
Mhm.
and trying to parse out the confusion. There's a point where you automatically assume the rich person because you look back at the end and it says wealth is bad,
Yeah.
can't serve God in wealth, and so that would imply the rich person would be the not good person.
Yeah.
But it comes right out and says the manager is cheating him.
Hmm.
And even that, like the technical aspect of it, he's managing the land.
Yeah.
So how is he cheating the rich guy, the landowner?
He's adding to what those people owe.
So he's adding, so he's making
So
the
he's
land workers, the
Ye-
subsistence farmers.
Yeah, right. So
He's increasing their debt, their burden.
right, their
Okay.
burden, and he would take. This is actually a really common thing in the ancient world. So a landowner would have a manager because you can't just hop on a plane and go, right? So
Mhm.
like, and then you tenant farm out the land, right? And then you paid a certain percentage in proceeds back to the landowner. And then the manager got paid by adding a certain amount on top of what was owed,
Okay.
right?
So the landowner would say, I need to make this much.
I
The
need you to give
manager
me
would
10
say,
jugs of olive oil
and the manager
every
would make it
harvest,
11.
and he would make it 11, and he would
keep one.
keep one.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And um, the technical term for this is tax farming. Um, it's actually a really bad system because it opens it up to all sorts of abuse.
Yeah.
Um,
And yet that's how our entire retail system works.
yeah, right, right.
The wholesaler adds on to the actual
Adds on
cost.
to the actual, right, and this is why people try to, as often as possible, go direct
Yeah.
to the wholesale, right?
Buy direct
right,
and save.
right.
Yeah.
Buy direct and save, right? You can bypass all those little fees
Yeah.
added up on top, right? So that's what's going on there.
Got it.
Mhm.
So why in this one
Mm-hmm.
does Jesus go with this incredibly confusing parable?
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like he just gives up and says, here's what I'm saying. You can't serve God in wealth.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problems are lectionary and squashing. I would have read just the parable and saved this for like next week or the next part, because like I don't think they're related, but I think you've got to kind of separate the two in your head.
Mm.
The parable's ending is actually make, kind of like I said in the sermon, the actual prescription from the parable is make friends for your, like, one, the children of light aren't that shrewd, is lesson number one.
Okay.
Right? That's what Jesus says, right? The children of this world are more shrewd with their own than the children of light.
Which again gets to the innocence factor then. The children of light must be more innocent.
Yeah, they're more innocent, and that's not necessarily right. Jesus isn't saying that positively,
Yeah.
right? And so that's one. And then number two is make friends for yourselves by dishonest wealth, right?
Yeah.
That's the actual two prescriptions out of that story,
Yeah.
right?
And by squashing it, we walk away with the.
Right, and then we get this next part, which I think is a related point about wealth, but I don't think it's here's the direct lesson from the parable. I think it's since we're talking about wealth, like, let's just be honest, right? And you haven't, and so Jesus starts off by saying, you haven't used your dishonest wealth for forgiveness and true community building and all that stuff, why would I think you would use God's grace for forgiveness and true community building?
Yeah.
You know, if you won't even use the stuff you're not supposed to have for that, why would you? Why would, when I gave you the real thing, would I think you'd use it for that?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And it's interesting in light of, several years ago, it was very big in the nonprofit community
Mm-hmm.
to investigate where your donations were coming from.
Yeah, I know, right?
And then you would reject,
You'd reject bad donations.
give back,
Right.
dirty money.
Yeah, right.
And yet this parable seems to be saying,
Which is
no,
like,
you should go ahead and take it and then do good with it.
Right. Take the mob money and put the stained glass window.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we're often, when I was a pastor in the inner city, my previous call, there's a guy who lived across the street, and this person dealt marijuana out of his house. But his cousin also lived there when I first was there, and his cousin dealt heroin. So I made a clear deal with the guy who dealt marijuana. I said, you kick out your cousin, I will ignore you. Like 2 weeks later, his cousin's kicked out.
Yeah.
Well, I was invited to his wedding later.
Wow,
I
okay.
mean, not the guy who was kicked out, but the guy who stayed. Like, we became good friends, but that was a deal, right? And like, I had some people that kind of ask me, like, why are you making that deal? He's still dealing, and I'd be like, look, like, he did the one thing I really wanted. Like, it was a deal, and everybody's better for it. The heroin dealer's out of the neighborhood. This guy doesn't cause all that much trouble. He's fine.
He's very low key.
He's very low key.
Yeah.
Like, like, everybody is better for this deal. And I think I think that kind of thing is what Jesus is calling us to, or like just take the money, guys.
Yeah.
Like sometimes that bad money comes with strings, like, which is bad. Don't take the money then as a practical matter. But right, like Jesus is saying, just take the money. Just who cares? Good's being done with it. Like, why do you care? Why do you care why he gave it? Like,
you're the one that can use it now.
Right.
Yeah.
So what if he's trying to buy his way into heaven? Or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, why do you care? You're going to be able to help people with it. And I think there's a hard-nosed lesson there.
Yeah.
That's hard for us to hear because, again, we want motives and everything to be perfect. And it's like, stop it. I was at community organizer training. This parable always reminds me of this incident I had at community organizer training. And community organizer training is a week long, and it's like boot camp. It's really hard, right? Like you're doing it for 12 hours a day. We spent 2 whole days on what was called SelfInterest, recruiting people via SelfInterest. And and it was these 2 days about how the real way you get people to work with you is you find their self-interest and then you tell them how your thing helps their self-interest, right? And like there are 2 groups of people at community organizer training. There's the like people from like the painters union and things like that, and they got this. They like did not struggle with this concept at all. We're really good at it. And then there's pastors. There's a group of pastors in the room also. And every pastor in the room was like having the hardest time with this one, and finally the woman leading, the most terrifying woman I ever met, and she goes, "You pastors, I just don't get you," is what she said, and then she goes, "You try and bribe people with food, you try and bribe people, with proper start times or whatever, you try and bribe people with childcare. Is it working?" is what she said. And then I was like, oh. She goes, "It's not working, is it? Like your churches ain't growing any faster than anybody else, no matter how much food you bring." I was like, that's a good point. She goes, and then she goes, your problem's not that. Your problem is you're not identifying where people's self-interest is, and so I think it's hard for us as religious people because we want to say self-interest doesn't play a role, this manager's self-interest, but it's like, well, actually, why are we so concerned about that? You're right. He has a survival instinct at work here.
Yeah.
But his survival instinct is leading him to write down people's debts. So why are we actually objecting to that.
Yeah.
Why is there an objection there?
So it's another case of what I call
Mhm.
selfish altruism.
Right. I mean, that's the other word for it, right? Their self-interest matters. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, his self-interest is to survive.
Right.
So
But there's still an altruistic element. The community benefits
right, the
as a
community
result.
does right, good comes of it. So I think that's where it's a hard lesson for us as good religious people,
Mhm.
but it's an important lesson.
So on the practical side then of the parable,
Uh-huh.
this has pretty much given me a really good perspective now on it.
Yeah.
But one last thing is, why is the landowner happy to be getting less money? The landowner
Well,
goes from firing the manager to saying, no, you're wonderful, even though you've cut their debt in half. I'm only making
half as much.
half as much now.
This is where I think the landowner is God, and I think this gets back to what I said in my sermon of God's fine being taken advantage of. God would actually prefer he be taken advantage of, and so I think Jesus is saying something about the character of God. Again, like this whole series of parables was set off by the Pharisees grumbling in chapter 15 about Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners.
Mhm.
And so from there, um, Jesus has told like 4 parables. This is the 4th parable in a row he's told. So we got the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son. And now we got this story.
Yeah.
And I think this is kind of his final nail in the coffin, trying to beat it home that, you know what? You're right. The tax collectors and sinners and prostitutes are here, and they might only be here, they might be trying to scheme something or game the system. And then Jesus goes, do you think God cares? Do you think instead God isn't actually happy that
They're at least here.
that they're here? Do you think
Yeah.
he's not at least happy that the manager, so what? Yeah, he was cheated out of more money. You think he needs more? He's already rich.
Yeah.
Um, the other part is the sums these people owe are astronomically large. Like they are.
They're like student loans today. There's just no way they're going to
Yeah, like they are like, I mean, like 100 jugs of olive oil is like the production of a small village. Like it's not like, you know, it's not like one person does this in a year. It is
Yeah.
like it's like 900 bottles of olive oil. Like it's a lot of olive oil,
Yeah.
like
More than even I would go through in a year.
right. Yeah, right. I mean, we cook with it every day, but like it's a lot of olive oil. So you're talking about reducing them from like one astronomically large number to a slightly less astronomically large number.
But it's still astronomical.
Right.
Yeah.
It's still large.
Yeah.
The distance between us and Pluto and us and Neptune is less, but it's still a large number.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and again, that gets to the character of grace, I think, that it's like, do you think God really is this divine accountant, tallying up pluses and minuses so that everything gets rounded, so everything gets calculated out to the exact decimal point,
Yeah.
And it's like, what makes you think that's God, instead of that God isn't cooking the books the entire time anyway,
Well, in light of that, why do we have this? And I know this is not in the Bible, but we have this huge popular mythology about Peter, at the Golden Gate with the big book that is a legend,
Right.
that he opens it up and it's like, well, let's see, you have 50,000 positives and 50,001 negatives. So I'm sorry you're not getting in.
That's a unfortunate confusion in our heads between last judgment and salvation. And so in our heads we think final judgment and salvation are the same thing, but actually they're not, right? They're in 2 different clauses in the creeds, right? For us and for our salvation, he came down from heaven.
Yeah.
Right? It's in the Nicene Creed. It's toward the beginning. He will come again to judge the living and the dead. Those are actually
They're separate.
They're separate things.
Okay.
Um,
Now distinguish them for me, though.
so final judgment is a process we all go through, and final judgment is a looking at our life and going, "Egads," because we will all look at our lives and be like, "Yeah, that wasn't."
So basically, what I do every night before I go to bed, it's
right.
it's like, oh, I can't believe I did that.
I can't.
today.
Right. Yeah, I can't believe I did that. We are all going to go through that with God, and that's final judgment. It will not be pleasant. Now that has nothing to do with your salvation. You can get to heaven and you're still going to go through that. You're going to be a baptized, faithful, trusting in all of Christ's promises. That does not get you a line like the free pass line at Disney to bypass that process.
Yeah.
Because we will all have to still go through that. And it's a different thing. And that's I think that's a perfectly fine motivation for doing things sometimes, is to be like, well, do I really want this one to be added to my typical example is there's this woman I drop off gift cards and a bag of groceries for most weeks. And she's lives all the way on Fifth Avenue. And it's 25 minutes and it's a whole afternoon when I go out to do it. And occasionally one of my colleagues asks, why do you do that? Why don't you just tell her no? Because she's never been to our church ever. She just calls, and I finally say, well, because I think when I'm going through Last Judgment and I'm up there in front of Jesus and Jesus asks, why didn't you help this person? It was really inconvenient and a long ways away is not going to be a good answer, at final judgment.
So that's at least one thing you don't have to cringe over.
Yeah, at least one more thing I don't have to cringe over. I can do this much, I don't have to wallow in my seat over that one too,
Yeah.
And I think that's a perfectly legitimate reason to do things. It's I don't want to add this also to the list of things that I know I am a terrible and miserable person over. I don't want to have to add this one to it.
Part of me is please, do I have to cringe? I already know. I've already cringed at my mistakes. Yeah.
Right. Well, and that's why I think part of final judgment is knowing where finally things settle down. There's a lot of things in your life you don't know were good or bad, and it's here's the final verdict on it all, but that's different than your salvation, Wow. So
that's good to know.
Mm-hmm.
That may give me some solace tonight when I'm reviewing my embarrassing moments of the day. We're almost out of time. The half hour has gone really quick. But Steve,
we did answer your question at the beginning, so it'll be on YouTube if you want to watch it.
Yeah.
Yep.
This is how we're driving up our YouTube views. Now you got to go home and watch. Steve had a really quick question. We've had a half hour of you explaining the parable, plus the bonus of your sermon today. So that's 45 minutes of explanation on this one parable. So Steve wants to know, would the people hearing the parable from this week have understood it, or would they too have needed someone to explain it to them?
I'm pretty sure they would have caught more things. They would have caught the numbers, for example. It took the numbers that these people owed. I think, again, when I said in my updated version, people understood that $100,000 to a loan shark is you're screwed.
Yeah.
I didn't have to explain that. I think everybody got.
So they're them having a cultural context.
Right. There were certain instinctually things they would have gotten.
Okay. So Jesus was really talking to his audience.
Yeah. There's this thing in the ancient world that they all assumed that we don't, which makes parables about money really hard for us to understand, and that's that the ancient world assumed money was a limited good. They assumed there was only so much wealth in the world. And so if you had more of that wealth, you were taking from somebody else's pie.
So Jesus's lines about
all wealth,
when you are wealthy, you have stolen from the poor.
Right, is a very literal thing for all, because everybody just assumed if you have more than your fair share, now your fair share may be greater or less than other people's. That's fine.
Yeah.
But if you have more than even what your fair share should be, you've stolen from somebody else. And now that is opposite our assumption, which is that wealth is infinite. We assume that wealth is always infinite and that it always grows.
Yeah.
Right? They just had no conception of that. To be greatly wealthy beyond your station was to be stealing from somebody else's pie.
It was almost literally on the backs of other people.
Right. And that's just how they assumed it worked. And again, so when he says, make friends of yourselves by dishonest mammon, by dishonest money or wealth, it's a little redundant because they all would have assumed that level of great wealth was kind of dishonest anyway.
To begin with.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, and so we say it and we're like, oh, that's weird, dishonest wealth, but they would have kind of they would have gotten that,
Yeah.
you know, and so there's a lot of shades of meaning in the parable that the easiest way for me to explain it was to update it, you know,
Yeah.
and to change the characters a bit, you know, instead of, because we assume a rich man's a good person.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of, most rich people were bad people, you know, and that was just their assumption. And so I changed the characters, you know, to rearrange the pieces.
Well, Steve, thanks you.
Yeah.
Get it to him. I just think the next time you have to interpret it, I'd like to see it done as with Muppets.
Muppets.
I think that would drive it home.
I would love a Muppet Passion of the Christ. I think that would just be, you know, the Swedish Chef can be Pilate.
Oh man, now you've got okay. Now my imagination is really going to town.
Yeah,
I
go
can
for it.
see it. I can see it. All right, cool. We are out of time. This was
Okay.
went really fast, but
Yep.
thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Ta. That went fast.
Yes.